Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, I'm going to be discussing the post-rotation meta. Now, we did hear about the 2021 rotation for the format quite a while back, but we're starting to get to that point where Darkness Ablaze is on the horizon, so it feels like a good time to discuss how decks are going to be coping post-rotation. First of all, we'll be talking about the best performers that were in the Ultra Prism to Rebel Clash format. Then we'll be giving a little summary of the most impactful cards that we are losing. Then we'll talk about those decks once again, which ones completely are irrelevant anymore, they are unusable, and also how those survivors will be coping in the new meta. For those of you who have forgotten, we are losing the sets Lost Thunder, Dragon Majesty, Celestial Storm, Forbidden Light, Ultra Prism, and we are losing promos from SM93 and below. So quite a large pool of cards that we are losing, some impactful stuff there, but we'll get into that in a moment. First of all, let's talk about the best decks that were in that Ultra Prism to Rebel Clash meta. Pikachu and Zekrom, Dragapult, Baby Blacephalon, and Turbo Zacian were more or less considered the top tier archetypes of this meta, I would guess. They had some of the best results over the various online tournaments that we had. Obviously, we didn't have any real Rebel Clash tournaments due to the coronavirus. So this is all we have to base our findings off of. It may be some slightly different data to if there were real tournaments, but this is the best we've got, so that's what we're rolling with. Also, there were some ADP variants that seemed to have a little bit of a dip from Sword and Shield meta, but Zacian ADP was still super relevant. ADP Spiritomb, as well as Spiritomb Beasts, were kind of new archetypes born from Rebel Clash as well. Cincino Control and also Magcargo Control / Mill, these sorts of variants. They were certainly less prevalent than when they were upon the initial release of Sword and Shield, but still relevant archetypes nonetheless. Obstagoon, as well as a bunch of the Mewtwo variants, were still in there. Ultimate Mewtwo, a wacky creation. Welder Mewtwo still doing reasonably well, and of course did win the international championships over in Melbourne, which was pre-Rebel Clash, but it's like pretty much the last big tournament that we've had to base things off of, so still in the hearts and minds of many people. And then on the right side of the slide, really, you're seeing some of the more kind of roguey decks that didn't have like huge performances at any one point, but were still notable in the meta. So Zacian LucMetal, Welder Box, Rillaboom, that could be based around Alolan Egg, or it could be based around Rillaboom VMAX, or a combination of the two. Green's PikaRom, mainly with like a thick Bolt-on line. Excadrill with Zebstrika. Malamar Spell Tag, Magcargo GX, an attacking variant, as well as Green Zard. There were a few other kind of niche ones that I could have talked about on this, but for the most part, they are also losing similar things to the ones already on this page. So I think that's enough detail for the decks that were doing the best pre-rotation. Now let's talk about the main cards that we are losing from the rotation. This is a real big snapshot of the main Pokemon, and you can see the most impactful ones down in this corner here. Malamar being a huge one. A few people are rejoicing that Malamar is rotating. They're pretty much fed up of seeing this sort of archetype. And many people kind of deemed this as a gatekeeper to other non-GX decks. Now, Dragapult kind of took that mantle on for itself because it can spread on, evolving basics quite happily with its attack on turn 2. But for the longest time, Giratina just spamming its own Distortion Door ability in combination with spell tags and Baby Blacephalon and stuff like that was really just causing a chokehold on other evolving decks for sure. And I think a lot of people are celebrating that this is finally rotating and going into the expanded format. Fire is losing quite a bit of stuff. It's losing a few of their one prize options, Turtonator and Victini Prism Star. Victini being like the main finisher of old Welder Box variants for the most part, where you are trying to spam Ninetales, you're trying to use your hearts, your flints, and your high energy attack costs to just get a bunch of fire into the bin, and Victini Prism does a ridiculous amount for just one Welder. And that is no longer an option. So Welder Box as we know it probably is going to be very different going forward. We're losing both the Smooth Over Magcargo as well as the attacking Magcargo GX, both strong as a mill option, but also we're seeing somewhat as an attacking presence in the meta. Blacephalon GX as well as charging up Naganadel. Charge Up was used alongside Quagsire, was used alongside Turbo Rayquaza sometimes, even Turbo Boltund most recently, as well as Blacephalon GX, that ended up being a bit part player in the format as time went on. But when this combo was first released, Blacephalon GX was like top tier for a decent amount of time for sure. Yveltal GX, certainly an important card as of late. We've seen it in Spiritomb, we've seen it in Obstagoon. It's seen sort of niche play throughout its time as well. So one of those interesting binder cards that did see the light of day now and then for some highlight reel moments. Zeraora GX is just one of the lightning support things that we're losing. PikaRom seems to be in a slightly worse place than it was. As you saw, it was pretty much top dog from this format. It does lose many pieces. This is just one Pokemon. It mainly loses more on the support side of things in terms of trainers and all that stuff. But Zeraora is a small loss for that deck for sure. Ditto Prism Star, probably the saddest loss for me personally, because I think it's such an awesomely designed card and adds so much to the creative space of, deck building, and it just opens up so many of these kind of niche stage ones to actually be valid in certain situations. So Ditto Prism Star, definitely one from me that I kind of tip my cap to. Some very nice card design there. Other than that, Control loses a huge chunk of Pokemon. Now, this is a really big deal because basically since Resource Management was printed, there's been Control variants, be it Zoroark or otherwise, that have just, ignored the traditional route to victory, which is taking 6 prizes, and just said, I will run you out of stuff by looping all of my stuff forever instead. We've seen that as well with Wondrous Gift Pokédoll shenanigans, so we're losing all of that stuff. Articuno was a big way to be an energy removal kind of approach. Shedinja, another kind of infinite loop kind of card. Mareep was used alongside the Magcargo for the sleep package. Girafarig was meant to get rid of opponents' threats that they could potentially reuse. And all of these other tech cards as well have seen play at different points in Control. Outside of that, some other big cards. I actually probably should have put the Jirachi Prism Star down here, but I ran out of space. Or I needed to fill space, I guess I should say. But Jirachi Prism Star, only really seen in this format, but certainly was impactful in how Zacian was performing. Zacian would still be on the map in the form of ADP, no doubt, but the Turbo Zacian seemed to be the most effective approach, and that's a big loss for that deck and a few other archetypes out there as well that were trying to cheat that prize race with the Scoop Up Net combination. In addition to that, Zacian is losing a few other Pokemon like the Dustmane Necrozma. Overall, though, a lot of metal stuff is going out of the format. We're losing a Alolan Ninetales GX, which had its chance in the spotlight, but kind of faded into obscurity. Fighting, we're losing Baby Buzz, which was like a big thing to have type coverage on. PikaRom, which is cool. And it basically means that the sort of good basic attacker plus beast option is taken away because Buzzwole and Nihilego are both rotating. Diancie as well, nice buff for fighting Pokemon. We're losing Quagsire and Volk, a pretty nice option for the water stuff, but nothing too serious there. We're losing a few interesting acceleration cards that we could have. Darkrai Prism Star would have been awesome with Eternatus to protect you around Crushing Hammer stuff, but that's no longer there. What else are we losing? Gramble is an archetype that was kind of like standalone. We're losing some fun Stage 2 shenanigan approaches with the Meganium and whatnot. All of this stuff, not hugely impactful. One thing I will say is the Solgaleos are super impactful for Mewtwo. Turbo Strike and also the Soul Burst GX no longer a thing, so those are all things to bear in mind. But for the most part, these are the most impactful Pokemon. Now let's talk about the energy, stadiums, tools, supporters, and items. Again, I've tried to separate the most important stuff and try to lump them together. For example, Lightning. Like I said with the Zeraora, Lightning is losing so much. The Mountain, the E-Power, the Volkner, these are all big, big hits, and was a huge reason why PikaRom was scaled so high, was because its damage output could go, tremendous on certain turns, and Thunder Mountain just made you a lot more fast and consistent at getting that full blitz quickly. So it loses pace, and it loses power and damage output, and these are both things that I think can be very awkward for PikaRom going forward. Speaking of pace and power going, Spiritomb loses a lot of that with Rainbow and Hustle Belt going. Rainbow isn't seen in like many other decks, but it does make Boost Mahala like slightly less versatile, but we do still have Aurora Energy. Shrine of Punishment played in so many non-GX decks, even to this day. Acrobike is another one of these like sad losses. I think it's like a great card for the game, especially with the new supporter rule change. Trainer-based draw is so important, and Acrobike was awesome at that, and also provided discard synergy, so that's like a big loss. A Skateboard, a really big loss because of how reliant we are on Jirachi. Now we can still play 4-switch, 4-scoop-up net, so that is interesting, but it does make Jirachi slightly worse and less spammable. Super Scoop-Up, I'm happy to see go because it was like a vanilla blanket statement you can use with VMAXs, just to be like, okay, we'll play the VMAX and Super Scoop Up and see how that works because they're tanky. So as more VMAXs get printed, I imagine Super Scoop Up would have become a problem. Custom Catcher's going. I wasn't a huge fan of this type of Gust. I didn't really like the high roll kind of thing, but it did kind of lean more towards things like Jirachi and more consistency to actually get Gust going. But I am more happy to see Boss's Orders sort of take over the game. And as soon as Boss's Orders came out, the Custom Catcher became way more niche, I would say. A few other notable ones here. We're losing Treasure, which was great search for Psychic stuff. Now, obviously, Malamar's going anyway, but Dragapult did like to use this. Fiery Flint, Heat Factory, a lot of special energy cards, a lot of, multiple type decks becoming less viable now with Rainbow as well as a bunch of these units going. A few interesting supporters here and there. Tool cards, Frying Pan, and Spell Tag seem to be the biggest ones. Beast Ring, one of the probably worst design cards I've ever seen, is finally going as well. So that's something to bear in mind. We're losing a few other of the Prism Star Stadiums, but we'll talk about the breakdown more as we talk through the decks. So, straight away, after seeing some of these things go, we can immediately cross off some of those some of those Ultra Prism to Rebel Clash decks off of our list. Straight away, we can cut Turbozation, because Turbozation was basically just based on using that Jirachi Prism Star package, which is no longer a thing. Mill/Control, I'm crossing off right now because even if we are seeing stall decks that don't want to take 6 prizes, and ultimately they may still be mill-based, they won't be the same as they used to be. They're not going to be infinite resource, using a bunch of Orangaroos, trying to get things back. It's going to be extremely different to how we've seen it before. Yes, we still have decent draw power through Intrepid Sword and Cincinnos and stuff like that, so you can see a lot of cards, but the approach of Mill/Control is certainly going to be different. It may go back towards, big tanky healing Pokemon with annoying walling abilities, that sort of thing. We've seen Wall Stall many times over, and that could be the new way that Control tries to adapt. We also see Ultimate Mewtwo is going. Of course, we lose the Soul Burst and we lose Turbo Strike, so that's awkward. The Malamar side of Mewtwo also going, so you don't have that same acceleration anymore. Welder Mewtwo, I'm saying, is surviving, but it does lose a few big pieces that we'll talk about later. Malamar Spell Tag, obviously we can't play Malamar, and the Magcargos are also out of here. So let's talk about, in a bit more detail now, what these decks are losing and how I feel like they're going to play going forward. Now, this is really talking just about rotation. This isn't really taking into account the Darkness Ablaze stuff. So this isn't talking about new additions that you gain, and it's not talking about matchup spreads. That's going to be for a separate video. Don't worry, it's in the works. I just need to get set confirmation from Darkness Ablaze, and it's all kicking off. But for now, we are just focusing in on these rotating cards. And as I said before, when you don't have that mountain, you really have to tunnel into the Coco Prism Star being the only way to get that full blitz quickly. That means that we're probably going to see even higher basic energy counts for PikaRom. We might even be seeing a return of Viridian Forest going into PikaRom decks as the stadium of choice, just to get more lightning energy in the discard pile, but then give you more access to discard even more. You're probably going to go back to that really high energy switch count. Very early builds of PikaRom played sometimes 3 to 4 copies of energy switch. That could be an option once again, so that you actually get that Coco Prism popping for 2 energy cards. One jumps over to the PikaRom, then you do a manual attachment and E-switch onto him, and then straight away he's ready to rumble because you don't have that mounted to fall back on anymore. Also, you could think about going more towards the Boltund route and just saying, I guess we're just having to PikaRom turn 2 now, trying to full blitz on 2 once you've used an Electrify with a Boltund, similar to how the Greens build played, really. That could certainly be another case to make for PikaRom, where it becomes more of like a stamping deck, where you're just trying to drop some prizes early whilst you set up your board, and then you're just going for these sorts of plays with Tag Bolt to get yourself back into a race. But without E-Power, I can see this deck struggling against basic V Pokemon, because 150 and even 200 damage is quite poor against basic Vs. So that's definitely something that I am concerned about for PikaRom. Bolton still can scale quite nicely, but that kind of relies on you keeping energies into play. So we'll see how that kind of plays out in the future. Dragapult also loses a few things. Acrobike and Treasure are big consistency cards, so that's a bit of a worry for sure. You also lose a bit of damage output. We saw Tord's list was quite shrine-based in the invitational that he played in. Also, Giratina was one of like my pet favorites in addition to Zigzagoons. So seeing that go is a little bit awkward, I think. And of course, the Malamar Scoop Up option is taken away from you. So you can only really play Streamline Pult now, but you're having to sub out things like Treasure and Acrobike for comms and other, you know, consistency cards. So I think there's a bit of a gap there for Dragapult. Not too detrimental in terms of the actual 60 that you can be playing with Pult. So it's still serviceable for sure, but I think we've got to make some changes to the engine for sure. Blacephalon also has a big engine overhaul. The damage output is still there. It's still on Blacephalon's side. You're still infinite. You can still just show your opponent 7 energy cards and be like, yep, get out of my sight. But it's going to be a lot slower for Blacephalon now. I think one of the biggest reasons why Baby Blounds was so strong was just because sometimes you hit those flints early and you power spike your way to a crazy knockout on like the second turn of the game, and that's just so much less likely now when a skateboard goes, so you're spamming Stellar Wish less, Acrobike goes, Fiery Flint, obviously the biggest one, because that's just 200 damage for one card, and Heat Factory as well. All of these things in combination, all going at once, means that like Blacephalon is bare bones, man. You're losing like 10 slots of your deck straight away, and that is rough. Try and make up, especially because you don't have any other alternatives out there right now. There's no real good energy search outside of like Spinner, which is like, does Blounds choose to just go second and play Spinners now? Maybe that's the way it goes, and maybe it's still serviceable, but then Spinner becomes so bad in the late game compared to Fiery Flint. So yeah, it's still, you know, to be discovered how Blacephalon's going to play. Maybe it goes to the full 4 giant half as an option. There's a few things it has to do. Now, I don't think Blacephalon dies because the damage output's still silly and it's still a one prizer at the end of the day. But there's a lot of consistency going, and the pace of the deck seems to slow down as well, which I think is important because it was too fast in this format. It was pretty gross at times. But I think people will still be playing this deck for sure, and finding a way to make it work. But it seems to be a lot slower and a lot fairer, to be honest. That's how it feels now. Zacian ADP loses a few pieces here and there. Like I said, Rainbow/Unit can be replaced by Aurora if need be. Acrobike was a nice card in the deck. And Frying Pan was actually kind of a big one. More so for Mirror often than not, but also good against like the Blounds and the other fire tech Pokemon that many people played. So falling into that trap of just being bopped for weakness by certain like up traders might be a bit of an issue if well things are to survive. But overall, I think Turbozation's gone, and ADP is still like definitely fine, especially if more and more VMAXs are coming into this meta. I know I wasn't talking about Darkness Ablaze too much, but as the meta moves more towards VMAXs in general, they normally give you that like 1 or 2 turns of time to actually do that GX attack. So if you can get the value of an ADP and then you're just, you know, trying to find your Zacian attacks and maybe gusting around the big VMAXs at times, that could be an easy win con for the deck. So Zacian ADP is basically untouched, and I think it's due for a comeback. One quick note on Turbo Zacian: if you want to play basically ADP-less Zacian going forward, you could think about Berserker, you could think about Turbo Patch as well. Again, it's a new card, but I just wanted to touch on it because like no ADP Zacian lists will be fine as well. Just not the Jirachi package anymore. For ADP Tomb, it loses a bit more than the Zacian build because that Hustle Belt and Rainbow were both such big deals. And Shrine, to be honest. Shrine was also, you know, in combination with the Jinx, a great way to get additional damage around your own board for extra threats with your tombs. So you lose a bit of consistency. The Acrobike and the Escape Board are actually kind of like a big deal as well. I think you kind of underestimate how big a deal this was, but they were really integral cards for ADP Tomb because you didn't have Intrepid Sword to fall back on. So you really needed those extra push cards throughout the early game to actually get rolling. So that's a bit of a worry. Also, losing so much of your damage mods is scary. So ADP Tomb did kind of come out of this set to be, you know, a challenge to you know, other ADP variants, a challenge to Zacian because of the damage output Tomb did with the Hustle Belt, as well as, you know, having type coverage against Dragapult. So it kind of was built for a specific meta and isn't necessarily one that stands on its own 2 feet in other metas. So I'd expect us to see a lot less play, especially as things, you know, the deck gets a lot slower in terms of its damage and its burst. So that is a main reason why I think it'll be dipping in play quite substantially. Spiritomb Beasts loses a ton as well. You lose your awesome GX attack of Doom Count, which was a way to cheese even VMAXs at times with the help of Zigzagoon pings and stuff, or just early prods of things. Buzzwole, a big Sledgehammer turn, was awesome for PikaRom for sure. Now, we've already said that PikaRom's potentially a little bit worse, so it may not be relevant as much anymore, but it still was a big swing turn. And ultimately, any turn that you're using your Buzzwoles, your Yveltals, even like your Nihiligos, those are all turns where your Spiritomb isn't in the line of fire and you're able to build Spite on the bench. So as all these other tech options kind of get stripped away from Spiritomb, it's looking for a new mate. And I think Hooper probably will be that friend going forward. But it just means that at the moment, like, you don't have any big swing turns. You're just kind of like doing like pretty mediocre average damage for the most part. Again, especially when there's Hustle Belt going, there's Shrine going as well. So there's just like no time for Spiritomb anymore. There are some replacements coming, but we'll talk about that in the next video for sure. Obstagoon also loses that Yveltal GX. Counter Gain and Escape Board, both decent cards for Obstagoon. Obviously, board for Jirachi, but also boarding your own Obstagoon so you could play around Raichu Paralysis was important. Counter Game is a good way to get an Obstagoon out of nowhere, even if they are targeting your energy cards. And Cynthia, a small consistency card. Obviously, you can still play Marnie or Research, but I thought I'd mention it. Ultimately, Yveltal was just a really good answer to anything that Obstruct couldn't deal with, that you could just like deal with their big threat all in one attachment and kind of sweep them off their feet in a turn. Whereas now it's kind of, again, you're in that spot where if your opponent just has an answer to the Goon, it's really hard for you to like deal with that threat. So Obstruct is getting slowly weaker, and you may have to go back towards like Sable IV as your option, which never really felt too great because it was a 2 attachment card. So I think it will become more obscure and more of a bit part player going forward. I don't think pure Goons will be that strong going forward either. Even though it doesn't lose too much, I just think the power of Obstruct gets worse as we move through the meta. Welder Mewtwo, losing Turbo Strike is like absolutely huge and devastating for Welder Mewtwo. Turbo Strike just allowed you to play non-Welder supporters on certain turns, and it allowed you to have that bit of extra clunk compared to Welder-based decks. You had less physical fire energies in your deck. You had just more, you know, like the tech Pokemon that you used to attack with, whereas the regular Welder Box decks, they were just playing a shed ton of fire energies and more hearths and all that sort of stuff. So you had that Welder activation much more live. And without Turbo Strike, Mewtwo can't really set up that board state where you get, you know, like 5 energies in a turn. That was like a big win con for Mewtwo, was just being able to Turbo Strike into a Jirachi in 1 turn. And then suddenly they've, you know, Welder attached and put 2 on the bench at the same time. And there's 2 Mewtwo's bearing down on you, all able to copy a really good load of attacks. With Turbo Strike gone, you're all in on like 1 Mewtwo every single time. And that's a really, really bad feeling and makes you even more reliant on Welder. So it seriously is a big loss for the deck. Turbo Strike pretty much carried Mewtwo, in my opinion, in a lot of matchups. You also lose Magcargo GX, which was a potential finisher. It meant that you could have that 1 big blow-up GX attack and just rely on Magcargo if you weren't knocked out, which is a low-key problem. And a few consistency cards, but nothing too major. I do think most of the Mewtwo things are no longer viable, so you don't have to worry about like Mewtwo Mirror for weakness or anything like that. But I am concerned that Welder isn't enough acceleration for Mewtwo anymore without that Turbo Strike help. So we may be looking towards other acceleration to get things going for Mewtwo. So watch this space. I think there are still a good amount of GXs that you can copy, but I think Welder may not be enough to sustain Mewtwo on its own. Zacian LucMetal loses a few pieces. Frying Pan probably the biggest of them, because if you are looking down at a fire matchup, you're feeling pretty bad, because all you really have to defend yourself is things like Crushing Hammers, and they are notoriously poor against fire decks because of Welder. So without Frying Pan, you're now sort of walking into a room knowing that you have auto losses, basically, which is a big concern. Losing Duskmane as well was a nice card as a one-of, usually, just because when Zacians are cleared off the board, it's not always easy for you to get your next Zacian online, and this was a good way to finish off, you know, tag team Pokemon and a few other things here and there, so that was nice. Also, it could help skew that prize trade for you if you didn't want to use the LucMetal, or if you had done something like Super Scoop Up on it, something like that. So that's a little bit relevant. Again, Acrobike, a skateboard. I keep repeating myself, but these cards are so huge for the meta, and a skateboard was quite important for this deck because of how often you want to switch out of a Zacian, then back into it, as well as Malolanaing your stuff as well. And when you don't have that easier skateboard option, you now need to always have Malolana plus that switch in hand, or double switch in hand, or switch scoop up net, all of those things. It's a combination. Whereas if you had a skateboard from previous turns, it was just there chilling for you. The Jirachi was able to come in and out freely. So I think that a skateboard is low-key making Jirachi a lot worse, and low-key actually making Malolana a lot worse of a card as well. So something to bear in mind. But I do think that Crushing Hammers are still super good in the next format, because I can imagine that Eternatus won't appreciate it as well as Dragapult. So I think Zacian LucMetal, again, going back to the fact that Turbo is no longer an option, it kind of makes you think, is LucMetal good enough? Is ADP good enough? And is a new build, a new branch of Zacian good enough? That's what we're going to have to inspect. I do think that the Zacian LucMetal build with Crushing Hammers has some legs to it for sure. Welder Box, we've already mentioned the Pokemon that it loses, and we've talked about the Fiery Flint and the Heat Factory losses in the Baby Blounds discussion, but just going to reiterate it here. When you don't have that late game bomb of the Victini, your entire game plan was building towards that, to be like, okay, I can overcommit in the early game, knowing that I have this get out of jail free card in the Victini that would just see me over the line. And now it's like, these Welders again, they're just not getting enough value. Like, you do your Heatran play, but then your Heatran gets cleared off the board, and suddenly you're back down to 0, and there aren't enough good 3-energy fire attackers anymore that just sees you through the game, unless, like, without that Victini Prism Star that could just see you over the line. So, yeah, it feels like you just really can't play this archetype the way we could previously. It feels like you've got to move towards maybe like Double V as your late game sweep kind of card. So you need to basically, again, give this an overhaul. Your consistency is a lot worse without the help of that Acrobike. The Heat Factory, the Fiery Flint as well was played as a 2 count in most Welder decks towards the end. So I think, again, this needs to sort of go back to the drawing board and add some new attackers into the mix. Maybe some other one prize fire attackers as well. Maybe look towards more Volcanion as well in the list, so that you can choose to go second, try and use that Volcanion as well as Welder to then build a bigger base to work off of throughout the rest of the game, so that you're not, you know, left with nothing after a Heatran gets knocked out, which is sometimes how this deck can feel. So yeah, something to think about for sure. Rillaboom loses a few pieces. Netball was a nice consistency option in addition to Quick Ball. Life Forest was actually kind of a big deal. Oftentimes you could get yourself a free turn with Life Forest if you were against some lower damage output decks. Really did help your Dragapult matchup as well when Eggrow was already healing 30 and Life Forest heals another 60. That was sometimes a big deal. And at the same time, we're losing a lot of our energy recovery pieces. We're losing Recycler and Energy Recycle System. I think both of these were played in most Rillaboom-based lists, at least as a 1 count. So the fact that you have to just go towards like ordinary rods, it feels really bad, because that's not like enough to get you back into the game in terms of using that ability and finding more to attach for turn and stuff. So I think you may have to just have a much higher physical grass count to kind of make up for it, and that can come with its own heap of issues. So Rillaboom, relatively intact, but it does lose a few nice cards, which then means that you can't really cut the same corners that you have done so far, and it kind of eats into your deck spaces, I guess. Green's PikaRom, very similar to regular PikaRom. Oh, I've got the going forward thing wrong for fire. Oh no. Okay, we're gonna have to talk about it ourselves. Well, you can see that I've been copy and pasting these slides the whole time. But Voltner wasn't hugely played in Green's PikaRom. But it was kind of like a supplementary card to go alongside those greens if ever you whiff them, and just meant that you could get those early game attachments if need be. I think really the biggest one is just like Wait and See Hammer being like a big tempo card in addition to greens. Normally this deck would choose to go second, so you could use Electrify and Wait and See Hammer to put your opponent back in tempo to then build up your own board state. So I think the Wait and See Hammer was actually like a really big piece of Green's Pika from whenever I played it. And again, the same things can be said where E-Power is going, Thunder Mountain's going, so a lot of reason to play the greens seems to be fading away, because oftentimes you'd be greening for Power Spike turns where you could like triple E-Power someone, or find those customs and do certain plays, as well as that early game Wait and See Hammer. So like the main incentive of green was to have those big plays, and I think that's kind of going. So yeah, apologies for not completing this slide, but we've talked around it. Hopefully all the rest are all okay. We have Excadrill. It's late, guys. It only loses a couple pieces. Like a couple of the Prism Stars, you know, I think you can get away with that, but Diancie Prism, it was actually like a big deal for damage output because it's so late until you get into the 11th hour tackle that 120 is like a really bad baseline when you're going up against tag teams. 140 is like a much more serviceable number. So that Diancie damage buff was actually like a really big deal. Ditto as well doesn't sound like a big deal, but it was always like the best thing to search for whenever you were using like your Great Balls or your Quick Balls, because it could be that backup Drillbur. But if your opponent doesn't deal with your active Drillbur for whatever reason, or if you just like put down the Ditto and then play a supporter card and then you miss the other piece, the Ditto is always there for you. So it was like a real relief card for you that kind of smoothed out your early game. So yeah, just naturally very good whenever you're playing multiple stage ones. Now you don't have that same sort of breathing room. And Zebstrika is the fastest way to self-mill. And you only needed like one Zebstrika in play at times. Whereas now alternate options like Cinccino's, for example, they can churn through the deck quite nicely, but you're going to need multiple of them. So that's like another headache in terms of space, in terms of bench space. In terms of your reliance on finding them and how quickly you can motor through that deck is all going to come into play. So Excadrill really does have to go back to the drawing board as well. Its typing may keep it relevant going forward, but I do think it's actually hurt quite a bit by these three individual cards. Green Zard, one of the last ones we'll talk about today, is again losing that Wait and See Hammer, which I think was a big draw towards these green decks, I must admit. Towards the end, at least, because of the nature of things like Dragapult, where it's one attachment at a time. And even things like Zacian, if you could get them to Intrepid Sword for another turn, that's like such a big deal for Green Zard, because you can punish them in so many ways by like greening for Tool Scrapper and stuff like that. So you do lose a few of those consistency pieces as well. It meant that you lost a lot of your deck thinning options. Like the Fiery Flint was actually a big deal, so you can make your Pokegears stronger to actually hit those greens. So you lose a lot of your thinning potential, which is pretty ugly when the greens are like the only important cards in your deck and everything else is like jank. So having no Acrobike and no Flint to filter all that jank is a bit of a problem, I think. Overall, Greenzard wasn't like a high performer in this format. It was kind of just like a thing that was around, and obviously there's the recent League battle decks, which is why I wanted to talk about the Greenzard, because you know it's easy to access this deck, but I do think that its consistency taking a small dip might be a bit of a problem going forward. So let's talk about the general shifts in the meta. Control pretty much gone, but that doesn't mean there won't be control in the future. I'm just saying, as we know it, it won't be the same again. It's more likely going to be walling, stalling stuff, or it's going to be aggro mill in the form of like Palisand, you know, where you're attacking to actually try and mill your opponent and using cursed shovels and those sorts of things. There's another one in Darkness Ablaze as well, the Toxtricity. So mill might become proactive in a different way, which is definitely something to bear in mind. Of the surviving decks, I think Lightning really is harmed by the loss of E-Power massively. I just feel like the scaling of hit points is just getting out of range without E-Power more often than not. I think you can survive without Mountain for most of these decks, but it's the E-Power that feels the hardest for me. And the fire decks do suffer. Like I said, there's no rebound for the Welder deck with Victini Prism Star. Mewtwo losing that Turbo Strike means that the Welder is just so much more essential, and if your Mewtwo just gets blown up, then you pretty much lose the game because you have no board position from then on. And Blacephalon is still surviving, probably best out of the ones that I've mentioned so far as a Welder deck, because there are still some alternatives around, but you're just way less bursty than you used to be. That kind of brings me on to the next point. Blown, Tomb, and Drill were pretty much like the most relevant one prizes outside of Malamar spell tags, and they all seem to take a dip as well, so they are a lot slower, I think, in the game. Tomb is going to find it more difficult. Like, a lot of the time, Tomb could take tempo prizes on things like Jirachis in the early game just to, you know, even start the race. Blacephalon could blow up a, you know, a V or a V max even by turn 2 if you hit 1 or 2 flints. And Drill just gets towards that late game damage output way later. So all of those things are big headaches for them. So it feels like you're looking to sack 1 or 2 prizes if you're playing these sorts of 1 prize decks going forward in the early game, just while you actually get towards doing what you want to do, which I think is a good thing overall, especially for Baby Blown. It didn't feel fun to play against Blown most of the time, I think. Either they drew hot or they didn't, and the outcome mostly came on that rather than actual gameplay between you. And the Mali tags, I mentioned the gatekeeping thing earlier on. Dragapult still does do that for the most part, but at least this is one other 1 prize deck that isn't kind of cannibalizing the others. Jirachi, I think, gets a lot weaker with the loss of a skateboard. Now, most of you will think, yeah, Jirachi's still going to be like a 4-of in a bunch of decks, and I think the same thing because there's still Scoop Up Net and Switch. But as a stamp proofing card, it's so much worse. Now Jirachi is just like, please let me start Jirachi in the early game so I can get into the game if I can't support a turn 1. Just gives you an extra 5-card dig towards like quick balls and stuff like that in the opening turns. Whereas, you know, in this meta, if you get stamped down to 2, you're still seeing like 8 cards because you could just promote your a skateboarded Jirachi, Stellar Wish for a research into your next 7, and like off you go. So I think we'll start seeing the power of Reset Stamp come back into the game a little bit more, because Jirachi was just like so good at foiling Reset Stamp from the offset. Ditto Prism Star, like I said earlier, I'm pretty sad to see it go, because stage 1s just seem super weak. Like, they already felt weak, but we lose a lot of tech ability for these stage 1s, and you know, we've seen a multitude of like dual stage 1 decks come out of the woodwork thanks to Ditto, or partly thanks to Ditto, and that's just like not an option anymore. So a bit of creativity loss in the game with Ditto going. And I'm also quite happy to see that Super Scoop Up, as well as that skateboard, so that people can't spam Malolana quite as much, is going, because, as I said, as more VMAXs get printed, most of them would look towards that generic option of just like, let me just undo a turn of damage on this VMAX real quick and set up this other one. I'm really happy to see that's no longer like a viable strategy. So yeah, those are the general shifts that I can foresee. So the next video, maybe not the very next video that I record, but upcoming, the next kind of discussion that we're going to be taking on is going to be talking more in detail about the new challenges coming into the game and how they will be affecting those post-rotation survivors that we've talked about. I felt the video would be way too long if I incorporated it into this video. So yeah, we're going to save it for another day, but we have started to look towards this set. We're super ready to do the set review. But we just need that confirmation of what cards are in and what are out, and then we can go ahead and shoot with it. So, yeah, Thanks so much for watching, guys. You've got something to look forward to. Hopefully this was interesting and kind of jogged your memory in terms of what was rotating. Got to apologize for that one slide as well, the green PikaRom. But hopefully I talked my way through it anyway. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video tomorrow. Cheers.